Good afternoon. I am Mike Duffy, president of the Cape Cod Tufts Club. And on behalf of the club, I want to welcome 146 participants to today's timely presentation on the Plymouth Colony. That truly is a remarkable number, 146. In addition to members of the Tufts community, we have alumni from 27 additional schools around the country, including members of the Intercollegiate Alumni Clubs of Cape Cod, representing local schools such as MIT, Harvard, and Yale. A few housekeeping items before we start the program. This meeting will be recorded and uploaded to our Tufts Alumni YouTube channel and the Cape Cod Tufts Club's website. Closed captioning is automatically turned on. If you would like to turn this feature off, click Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen and hit Hide Subtitles. Here you also have the option to view full transcript if you'd prefer. You will notice your audio and video are disabled. Once we begin, you will see the presenter on your screen. You will be able to hear him, but he will not be able to hear or see you. You may need to adjust your volume. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, you can do so by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. This will open a window where you can type your questions. After the presentation, Amanda will read the questions for our speaker to answer. Now I'm going to pass the video off to Sue Martin, a member of our board, who will introduce today's speaker. Sue?
Thank you, Mike. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker for today's program. David Martin was born and grew up in New Bedford. He counts 8 Mayflower passengers and crew among his ancestors, thereby giving some indication of his interest in the topic of the talk today. An educator by profession, he has been a school teacher, an administrator, and is a retired professor of education from Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., where he was Dean of the School of Education. Since moving back to Massachusetts, he has become involved in many local organizations. He is past president of the Cape Cod Genealogical Society, president of the Marston's Mills Historical Society, treasurer of the Yale Club of Cape Cod, and president of the Cape Cod chapter of the American Guild of Organists. His degrees are from Yale, Harvard, and Boston College, and he also knows Tufts quite well from the years of dating while I was a student there. Please welcome my husband of 59 years, Dr. David Martin.
Thank you very much. Today's talk will address what we think as perhaps a forgotten or somewhat neglected chapter in history, namely the place of Cape Cod within the Plymouth Colony in its first century. With all of the discussion and attention and focus that has been given in the past year on the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower's arrival, and all of the attention that is focused on Plymouth itself, it's quite easy to see how the function and the purpose of Cape Cod and its essential role could be somewhat neglected. What I'm going to share with you today is a synthesis of some of the points that came from a symposium sponsored by the Cape and Islands Historical Association just a few months ago, which was consisting of 10 essays that were designed specifically to address the role of Cape Cod within the Plymouth Colony. So I'm going to start by doing a share screen here, and I will proceed with the presentation at that point. This presentation will consist of a series of anecdotes and historical waypoints. And of course, I would welcome questions and comments at the end. And I'd like to begin with a look at how Cape Cod was perceived. This is clearly a map or a chart of Cape Cod that much follows the arrival of the pilgrims in 1620, but I show it to you partly because it shows the settlements that grew up post Plymouth Colony, but also because of the frequent distortion of the geography of Cape Cod, which is perfectly understandable at the time, since measurement instruments were not at the level of even just 100 years later. This is another view of Cape Cod, and this is a particularly interesting one. We think this one is definitely a 17th century chart. And if you were emigrating to North America from England, this is the way you might have perceived where you were heading for. And my point is that north is not up, north is to the right. And so in the foreground, you see the hook of Cape Cod, which is the first thing you'd see as you approach the shore, and so on. And so this is a matter of how maps do affect our perception, or how our perceptions are reflected in our maps. This map, on the other hand, is particularly dated 1614, and it was constructed by John Smith. And most of us know that John Smith was instrumental in founding the Jamestown colony in Virginia prior to 1610. And he also had made maps of the East Coast. In fact, he was perhaps considered to be likely to have been a Mayflower passenger, although he ended up not being a part of that group. But they had his map, we're pretty sure. And so, again, you see a very understandable distortion of Cape Cod in the lower left corner, but that's certainly recognizable. I'd like to point out that it was called Cape James. Of course, it was named for James I of England, or James VI of Scotland, who was king at the time. And you'll notice Cape Cod Bay is called Stuart's Bay, namely, of course, for the name of the dynasty that was on the throne in England at the time. And then, of course, a more modern map. This is a 1950s, what I call a cutesy map of Cape Cod, which we'll come back to in a moment, but this is just here to help get our orientation back. This is the cover of the symposium that I referred to that was held in October of 2020. And of course, it's a painting of the Mayflower at anchor, probably in Plymouth Harbor, with the beach in the foreground that you can't see, and the peninsula ahead. So this, of course, would have had to have been at sunrise when the artist did this. And those of us who had the chance to see the Mayflower 2 come to Cape Cod from its having been reconditioned significantly in Connecticut. This picture is reminiscent of something that occurred just a few months ago, as she was brought through the Cape Cod Canal on her way to her permanent berth back in Plymouth once again. So how about the role of Cape Cod within the Plymouth Colony? Well, obviously, the very first connection has to do with the landing. And this is a depiction of the route of the Mayflower that was developed by my colleague, Professor Bill Horrocks of Chatham, which very carefully plotted the Mayflower as she approached what they thought was the central part of the East Coast, because they were headed for the so-called northern part of the Virginia colony, which meant, we think, the mouth of the Hudson. Well, clearly they were off course. And so as they approached Cape Cod, they knew of it because of previous visits that had been made by some Europeans, and they realized that they needed to head south. And so they came about and headed south. And then, of course, as you follow the dark red line, they realized that they were going to be in trouble very soon, because they ran into the famous shoals off of Monomoy, which were breaking and could very much put the ship in the danger of foundering. Luckily, Captain Jones came about in time, and the ship then sailed back north, and off of Chatham, somewhere they changed course slightly and continued toward the northwest, following the Purple Line. If you follow the Purple Line up to its end, that's where they hove to overnight, and then the next day they made straight for the peninsula and came around and landed in underneath the shelter of the hook of what we know today as Provincetown. And so this is pretty much reconstructed from the journals that were kept at the time. Obviously very precarious, and they might well not have made it successfully if they hadn't had Captain Jones and his navigation team to lead them. Uh, this is, of course, a modern view of Provincetown Harbor, but you can see very clearly what a natural shelter it would have been. This, of course, was taken from an airplane looking to the east. And so you can see what a beautifully sheltered harbor that Provincetown was. This is probably what they saw when they came ashore. This particular scene is a photograph of the beach at West Harwich. So obviously what's in front of you is Nantucket Sound, but this is very typically likely that this would have been what they saw, namely sand, water, and dunes. And of course, we know that a famous historical event took place in Provincetown Harbor, namely the signing of the Mayflower Compact. Sometimes some historians have held this up as one of the original founding documents of the American democracy. Later historians have said that's putting too much weight on it. It was an agreement that was signed in order to prevent the different groups of passengers on the Mayflower from spreading out. Two particular groups, the group of separatists who were coming to North America for religious freedom, and the group of others who were coming for economic gain. And so the compact was signed in order to keep them together, because if they had wandered off and done their own thing, as we say today, the colony would probably not have survived beyond when it did. So it is known as the agreement between the settlers at New Plymouth. And this is a photograph of the actual document. I'm not going to take the time to read it all to you, but it is a very typical 17th century language that you would use in an agreement. So that's the first waypoint, of course, of Cape Cod's importance in the Plymouth colony, but it's definitely not limited to that. Immediately, there were some issues that faced these Mayflower passengers. First of all, just physical survival. Secondly, they were facing what seemed to be an unpopulated land. Now we know, of course, that a reason it was unpopulated was not only because it was November and therefore not the time when the native peoples would be on Cape Cod, but also because there had been an epidemic that had devastated a great number of the native population just several years before, probably from the visit in 1617, or perhaps earlier from some other Europeans who brought disease with them. And then, of course, they began to encounter the different concepts of land ownership and immediately began to see that their concept was different from that of the native peoples. To a European, when you purchased a piece of land, it was yours, and you would not be need to allow anyone to be on it without your permission. On the other hand, for indigenous peoples in North America, the concept is entirely different, that you could purchase or own a piece of land, but that would not prevent others from coming to hunt and fish on it. And so you can see that this situation was tailor-made for conflict right from the beginning because of cultural differences. So not many days after the landing at Provincetown Harbor, they began to realize that they would not be able to stay. They needed to go in search of a better place to have the development of a more permanent colony. And so the Mayflower ship had what's known as a shallop, which is basically a large boat that has sails on it and is used for exploration. This happens to be a photograph of a reconstructed shallop known as the Elizabeth Tilley, named for one of the Mayflower passengers. And I'm actually on there, standing near the bow on a trip that we reconstructed several years ago, sailing all day from Plymouth Harbor down to Orleans. And I'll say more about that particular incident. But in any case, it was in a boat like this that they began to explore the inner shore of Cape Cod Bay as they were searching for another place to set up a permanent settlement. And this leads us to one of the other key points about Cape Cod's relationship to the Plymouth Colony. As they sailed down the inner coast, they began to come close to what we know today as Barnstable, and were ready to go in there, which would have been a very appropriate natural harbor. You can see that it's protected by Sandy Neck, which is still there today, although it's longer than it was in 1620. But they were prevented from doing so by a anomaly of the weather, namely a snow squall came up, and they were not able to get into Barnstable. And so what happened then was they missed the opportunity to go into Barnstable, which probably would have been the center of the Plymouth Colony had they been able to get in. The Historical Society of Old Yarmouth has set aside December 12th, which was the date in which this exploration took place, as SOB Day. They known as the Sail On By Day. So for us Cape Codders, that was a near miss, but that is in part a point of fact what we think is likely to have happened had the weather and the snow squall not come up. It was less than a year later, in 1621, when, after they had settled at Plymouth, uh, there was a need to then re-involve themselves in Cape Cod. Young John Billington, who was the son of the Billington family, a Mayflower family, got lost in the woods of Manomet, and he was found by native peoples, and then he was taken by them further down to Cape Cod. Uh, Down in what we think is the area of Nauset, then the native group there, the Nauset Native Americans, then sent a runner back to Plymouth saying, "We have one of your children." And so an expedition was organized to go from Plymouth all the way back down to Nauset to rescue John Billington and bring him back to the colony. And so right away, then there was an incident that re-involved the people who were settling at Plymouth into Cape Cod. Just as a footnote, the Billington family in the Plymouth Colony did some, what we would say today, not very good things, and got into trouble on numerous occasions. And a member of that family was actually executed for murder later, but that's a whole other story. And then we have the development of what we know today as the Cape Cod Canal. And many people realize that as early as 1623, only less than really 3 years after the arrival of the Mayflower, Miles Standish noticed that two rivers were very close to each other. The source of the Manomet River flowing into Cape Cod Bay and the source of the Scusset River flowing into Buzzards Bay were very close to each other. And of course, people used the short distance between the two sources as a place for portage in order to carry boats from one to the other when they wanted to go from one bay to the other. And so he proposed that, he noticed it, it was a very logical thing, And of course, we know today that it took almost 300 years for that canal to become a reality. It wasn't until 1914 that it had actually become operational. After several different tries that took place during the 18th century and the 19th century. So the Cape Cod Canal then became a vital cog in the wheel of Cape Cod for some reasons that we'll look at in just a few moments. And there, of course, is a picture of the modern view of the canal. Then in 1627, we know from Governor Bradford's journal that there was another incident which definitely involved the Plymouth people into Cape Cod in a very direct way. There was a ship known as the Sparrowhawk, which was carrying some passengers headed for the Virginia colony. And this by now should sound familiar. And they ended up unknowingly at first on Cape Cod. And they had a different fate than the Mayflower. Namely, they headed south, just as the Mayflower did, but ran into shoals and the ship foundered. And the word reached the colony, the headquarters back in Plymouth, as the result of native peoples, that there were some English who were stranded on the shore. No one drowned, they were all saved, but their ship was, in many cases, what you might consider a wreck. And so Governor Bradford and a crew once again got in the shallop and went all the way from Plymouth, in this case, back to Rock Harbor. And that was the particular voyage that I was part of a reconstruction of just a few years ago. So in order to demonstrate not only that it was done and could be done, but how much time it took. Namely, it took pretty much of an all-day sail. So Bradford and his rescuers found the people from the Sparrowhawk. They repaired the vessel and waited until it left, and it foundered a second time. And this time it was completely unsalvageable. And so Bradford invited these passengers, less than 20 people, to come back to the Plymouth Colony. It was now winter, and to stay at the Plymouth Colony until they could find a way to really indeed get back to Virginia, which was their original destination. We know from Bradford's journal, written in very polite 17th century English, that the behavior of the Sparrowhawk passengers was not what we might consider today as exemplary. They didn't fit in well with these religious separatists at all. And Governor Bradford relates that they were quite pleased to see them leave when spring came. And it took 2 sailing ships to get them on their way down to Virginia, which they ultimately arrived at. And so here again, the Plymouth people are being drawn back repeatedly. We see a pattern here onto Cape Cod. The bones of the Sparrowhawk are visible from time to time. They are, of course, timbers, and they reappear once in a while when the ocean washes away the sand and then covers them up again and reappears once more. This happens to be a 19th century drawing of the bones of the Sparrowhawk, which were put on display. There's not anywhere near that many timbers still available, but they can be seen at some low tides. And then a significant economic event, again in the same year, namely an important trading post that was set up in Bourne, which we now know as the Patuxet Trading Post. And this was a 3-way exchange opportunity between the Narragansett Native Americans, the Dutch settlers of New York, and the English settlers of Plymouth Colony. And this became a place for trade, which then resulted in income which the natives, or the residents of the Plymouth Colony used to help settle the debt that they owed to their English sponsors in order to become more independent. And of course, the good news about that is that you can visit the Aptuxet Trading Museum today. This is a picture of it in about the 1930s when it was reconstructed. And this is a picture as it looks today. And I'll say that if you'd like to have an interesting day, if you haven't done this, combine a visit to the Aptuxet Trading Post, which is a museum, and also the other facility operated by the Bourne Historical Society, namely the Gray Gables Railway Station, which is a reconstruction of the railway stop that was constructed specifically for President Grover Cleveland when he had his summer White House in Bourne. And it makes a very nice day trip and, of course, very historically illuminating as well. Then something further began to happen. In 1638, the court of the colony gave permission for Stephen Hopkins of the Mayflower, and he was a Mayflower passenger and was the only one who had been to North America before coming on the Mayflower. And he got permission to build a house in what we know today as Yarmouthport, was called Matachese at that time. And then a year later, some of the English settlers of Cape Cod, who were not from the Plymouth Colony, but from elsewhere, began to set up residence on Cape Cod. And we oftentimes mark the beginning of the historical Principality of Cape Cod as 1639. I'll come back to this point in a moment, namely the fact that the settlers of Cape Cod began to be not only from the Plymouth Colony, but from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Also, at about the same time, 3 Mayflower passengers settled on Cape Cod. Giles and Constance Hopkins, who were Mayflower passengers and the children of Stephen Hopkins, and Joseph Rogers, who was the son of Thomas Rogers and also was a Mayflower passenger. And then very soon, in the same time period, the descendants of 7 more Mayflower passengers came back to Cape Cod. These people were known as the Nauset First Comers, and their surnames are still prevalent today on Cape Cod: Winslow, Warren, Fuller, Bradford, Doty, Hopkins, of course, Eaton, and Howland. And 4 of those people are a part of my own particular Mayflower ancestry. And one of the points that has been written about this is that, and I quote, while the Puritans from Massachusetts Bay were a comfort to the Pilgrims, they were also a problem. It was obvious from the start that they would be serious rivals in trade. Thanks to a storm that drove their ship into Plymouth Harbor, the people of Plymouth discovered that some of them were already trespassing on Cape Cod, carrying on a surreptitious trade with Cape Cod. And so Governor Bradford sent the ship back to Boston with the warning that such attempts would be resisted, quote, even to the spending of lives, close quote. The members of the Plymouth settlement were also afraid that the Puritans would encroach from the north and even claim all their territory. Massachusetts Bay had a proper charter from the English government, but the Pilgrims' claim rested largely on being in Plymouth first, because their patent was vague and faulty since it had originally been for the northern part of Virginia or the Hudson mouth. And so Plymouth's boundaries had never been sharply defined. They got their powers of government only from the Mayflower Compact and could be challenged at any time. And so this sets up another very important aspect of the colony and the importance of Cape Cod within it. Just as an interesting additional note, 2 of the governors of the Plymouth Colony lived on Cape Cod. One of those was Thomas Prince, one of my ancestors, who had served 2 terms as governor of the colony, 1634 and 1638. And he had arrived on the first ship after the Mayflower, the Fortune, in 1621. He was married 4 times, and the first one was to Patience Brewster, who was the daughter of Mayflower passenger William Brewster. He was also one of what we call the undertakers, which has nothing to do with funerals. The undertakers were a group of people who took it upon themselves to remove the debt that the Plymouth settlers had to their British sponsors. And of course, by setting up trading posts, they accomplished that. The other governor of the Plymouth Colony, who was a Cape Cod resident, was Thomas Hinckley. And of course, Hinckley is a surname that is still very well widespread in the Mid-Cape area today. So by 1635, the village of Plymouth had become numbered about 350 people. And they felt the pressure from the newcomers who were coming to seek land to the south. And for William Bradford, Cape Cod was, quote, a promised land, quote, of, and these were the 3 features: mature forests, rich sandy soil, and friendly native peoples. There was a patent in 1630 that gave the Pilgrims title over these lands, but there were some legal problems with that claim. And so by the middle of that decade, 1635, tensions had started to grow over the settlement of Cape Cod, or I should say, the resettlement of Cape Cod. And the Puritans to the north were getting hungry to own land and to conduct trade, which was, of course, what they were very much interested in. So what did that mean? And what did that lead to? This, by the way, is not a very clear picture of the residence of Thomas Prent's, which is in Eastham, and that is able to be visited when the pandemic is over. So what I've just talked about, the increase in Cape Cod population in the 1640s led to the need to, from the point of view of the residents of the Plymouth colony, to control the influence of these new English residents who were coming from outside the colony, and to be able to maintain what they had established as their ownership and residence on Cape Cod itself. And so what happened next was the laying out of town boundaries. And architect Morse Payne, who only passed away 3 years ago, noticed something very interesting. By the way, he was the architect of the middle school in Orleans on Route 28 in the middle of Orleans. That's the one that has different colored bricks instead of windows. In any case, this is a picture of Morse Payne, a brilliant mind, and he noticed something fascinating. And that is, if you take a look at the 17th century indications of Cape Cod, and you draw a line of the boundary between Harwich and Dennis straight north to Race Point, that is the exact magnetic north line that was true in 1620, or really I should say 1635, 1640, because magnetic north does vary. So that's an interesting thing in itself, he noticed. Then he noticed that in our current line of town boundaries, that the border between Truro and Wellfleet, if you draw the line and project it westward, it forms an exact perpendicular angle with that north-south magnetic north line. Not only that, but the line of border between Wellfleet and Eastham does the very same thing, as does the line that's the border between Eastham, known as Norset originally, and Orleans. So all 3 of those are perpendicular to that magnetic north-south line of that was drawn first. But it becomes even more interesting. If you take a look at the angle of the line between Barnstable and Yarmouth and draw that line that projects it back to that previous intersection, it particularly intersects at what we would call a compass point. as does the line you draw for the border between Barnstable and Sandwich, and so forth. And so something was going on there that, in Morse Payne's opinion, is far more than a coincidence. The fact is that these lines that go parallel from Truro, Wellfleet, East Ham, and so on, were divided into equal segments for those 7 families that originally came from Plymouth and resettled on Cape Cod. In addition, all the geometry works. The unfortunate part about that is an examination of the journals kept by contemporary people, namely Morton and Bradford, make no mention of the actual act of drawing these lines. And so that would be what we would need in order to establish it. I was part of a group called the Cornerstone Project, however, to see if we could establish that. And so part of our crew went up in the fire tower in Wellfleet, and the crew that I was in went up in the fire tower in Plymouth on a particular Saturday in the spring, and we had mirrors, and our intention was to flash mirrors across to each other to show that perhaps these particular Plymouth Colony residents could have established that point in the middle of the bay by using mirrors reflecting the sun back to somebody standing on the land. We did use mirrors, and we were ready to observe the mirror coming back from the Wellfleet fire tower. And at that point, a fog moved in, and we never could actually definitively say that we saw their mirror. However, we did flash the mirror to a couple of other places on the land, and we are told that it was indeed visible. This is not able to be proven, therefore, it is an hypothesis, but it is a fascinating one. Not only that, but we see some further evidence. And that evidence, oh, and by the way, this is a projection of those lines that showed how they would project throughout the Plymouth colony. The boundary lines, in some cases, have been discovered. And this is a photograph of the boundary line that is found behind Anthony's Cummaquid restaurant in Cummaquid. I've seen it myself. What you do is you go down to the shore of Cape Cod Bay, and at low tide, you have to uncover the mud a little bit, and you will see this particular stone and marking. And Y, of course, is Yarmouth, and B is Barnstable. And an archaeologist has been brought in and has said, yes, that is definitely 17th century writing. And so there's been another discovery of a marker elsewhere on Cape Cod as well. So there is some evidence that this was a process that took place in the 17th century. And if nothing else, I find it's an intriguing thing to think about. So just to summarize, what do we know, and how does Cape Cod fit within the history of the Plymouth colony and its significance? We first of all, of course, said that Barnstable could easily have been the colony center. That's a historical if. We will never know that, but we do know from the record that a snow squall came up and prevented going into Barnstable Harbor, which was apparently the intention. Uh, they, of course, are permanent settlers that came from Plymouth itself back to Cape Cod. It became an expansion area, but as it expanded, of course, they saw the need for boundaries to prevent encroachment from the other colony, Massachusetts Bay, which ultimately absorbed the Plymouth colony in 1692. The fundamental centrality of the canal as a geographic but particularly economic benefit for the entire colony. And of course, that is definitely a Cape Cod feature. And then the interesting differences in the relationships between the English settlers and the native peoples. Uh, uh, they were not always friendly, in some parts of the Plymouth Colony. But as far as we know, with a couple of exceptions, the relationship between the settlers of the English settlers of Cape Cod and the native peoples were largely peaceful. And so that is a difference. Of course, the economic impact of the trading post, it's something that affected the entire colony. And of course, Cape Cod had two governors of the colony. And the attraction of more arable land than Plymouth had began to draw back the settlers of the Plymouth location back to Cape Cod to resettle. We know from the record of history that Cape Cod paid 1/3 of the colony's taxes during the time that it was identified as an element of the colony. And something I haven't mentioned before, the Quakers in the 1650s came into the colony at the Plymouth area and were not welcomed. And so they came to Cape Cod, where they were welcomed and established a meeting there, which still exists to this day in Sandwich. And that was something that set Cape Cod off from the rest of the colony. So where do we go from here? Well, I want to just point out that there's a continuing encouraging movement right now in today's world to separate legend and myth from fact. And currently I'm reading a book, I'm just holding it up here. The title is Made in America, The Pilgrim Story and How It Grew by James Baker, published by the Mayflower Society. And it's just been published this year and goes point by point through various aspects of the Plymouth Colony and helps to explore what really happened versus what has come up and risen up during the 18th and 19th centuries of creation of myths and legends about the stories of the first settlers. It does not deal directly with Cape Cod, but of course it's very relevant. I think we need to continue to develop better understanding between the native peoples and the European settlers. And of course, the notion of land ownership is only one of those. And that means changing the teaching about Cape Cod and the Plymouth Colony to reflect better understandings. I have a colleague who is a teacher in a middle school on Cape Cod who has a whole unit of instruction called Tall Hats and Headdresses. And as a way of working against the myths that surround how the first Thanksgiving really looked and so forth, she has developed some techniques for educating the children on some of the actual facts that have been ignored or pushed aside about things like the first Thanksgiving and other things that we probably all learned erroneously when we were in the third grade. And lastly, we need to continue to work hard to preserve documents and memories. I'm happy to report that the Cape Cod Genealogical Society, a year from now, is going to have a full day of exploring how many of the preserved archival documents that are original can be preserved and put in digital form for future generations to enjoy. There are a great many original manuscripts and the like that are in repositories on Cape Cod, and we must make sure that those are preserved in a way that future generations can have access to them. A reference that I'll leave with you, the only book that I've found that deals with this particular topic, Cape Cod and the Plymouth Colony in the 17th century by Roger King. And so I'm going to wind it up now and be glad to answer questions or comments at this point. So I thank you very much.
Okay, great. I'm just going to turn my video on.
And this is my email address in case anyone wants to send me a message if we don't get a chance to respond to your question during this session.
Okay. All right. There we go. So hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Tremont. I work in our alumni relations office at Tufts, and I've been there for almost 4.5 years now, and I love working with Cape Cod Tufts Club. And thank you, Dr. Martin, for what has been a super interesting presentation. We've got questions that are rolling in. So while we only have about 15 minutes to devote to Q&A, Dr. Martin is kind enough to have left his contact information, and we can also put that in the chat. But if we don't get to your question, please feel free to send him your question via email. All right. So here's the first one. You mentioned the Cape being unpopulated in the winter. Did the native people in the area leave for the winter and then return for the summer? If so, they were certainly our first tourists.
The answer is absolutely yes. The Wampanoag were seasonal in the sense that they, for the winter, did leave Cape Cod. They left, of course, things that they stored for the winter, one of which was a cache of corn that the Mayflower arrivals actually helped themselves to, which was not pleasing to the Wampanoag, and they eventually repaid that. But yes, seasonal. But the lack of population also was due to the epidemic of smallpox that had been brought from Europe a few years earlier.
So related to the Wampanoag, what do you see as a really outstanding source for information about the Wampanoag people on the Cape and in the Plymouth areas?
I'd have to check my my library on that. If you don't mind giving me your email address and send me that, I will certainly look that up for you and send you a reference. But there are good references, and particularly in the past year when we've had so many publications coming out around the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower.
Thomas Pence is a favorite ancestor of mine. I've seen photos of his house, but was under the impression that 50 to 75 years ago, it was torn down. The house still exists?
There is a house that they say is the home of Thomas Prince. I have been under the impression that the picture that I have shown on my presentation was an earlier picture, and that may have been the one that was torn down. So I'm not 100% sure if the one that is currently able to be viewed is a reconstruction, but it is in Eastham. I'd be interested in any information that you have, so I'd love to have an email contact from you if you have some information on that.
And so again, to all our attendees, we're going to post Dr. Martin's contact info, so you can relay that information to him. Okay. Just scrolling through. Do you have any information relating to Squanto's presence and burial area?
The Squanto's presence is an interesting story in itself. He had been actually captured by an earlier English expedition and taken back to England, which is how he learned some English, and then came back. And that, of course, greatly surprised the English settlers when they found someone that who was a native person who spoke English. I'm not sure about his burial place. His Wampanoag name was Tisquantum, but he learned English because he was taken against his will to England for a period of years, and then came back before the Mayflower.
Can you provide the spelling of the trading post you mentioned in your presentation?
Yes, it's a very odd spelling for speakers of English. It's APTUCXET. The temptation is to put the X in front of the C, but it's APTUCXET.
What was the title again of Roger King's book?
Oh, all right. Cape Cod and the Plymouth Colony in the 17th century.
All right. Can you provide the address again? I missed it. Why did the first folks that left Plymouth for Nauset leave? Did they wish to leave or were they asked to leave?
The first people from Plymouth that went to Nauset to settle did that of their own accord, as far as we know. So they were not asked to leave that I know of.
Okay. Can you tell us more about your sail on the shallop?
Yes. As I mentioned before, as part of this project to reconstruct what had happened in the situation with rescuing the sparrowhawk, a group of us were invited to take the shallop from Plymouth Harbor on a particular day to Rock Harbor in Orleans to demonstrate not only that it could have been done, which is no question at all, but also how much time it would take. It did take us a full day. We left at 8 in the morning and arrived at 3 in the afternoon. I will say that we were only able to sail part of the way, and then we were becalmed, and we did have a tow for about an hour, and then the breeze came up. But that was an all-day affair, and by great good luck, when we were sailing into Rock Harbor, a priest had just finished blessing the fishing fleet at Rock Harbor, and we were the last one in, so inadvertently we got blessed. I'm not sure that the residents of the Plymouth Colony would have particularly appreciated that, because of course that was Catholic and they were Protestant.
When did the Cornerstone project take place? Is there a chance that you will try to do it again?
The Cornerstone project was very active about 10 years ago, when an attorney named Michael Farber became very interested in the work of Morse Payne. Morse Payne was still living at the time, and that the interest in that has died down, in the sense that we've found all that we thought we could find. But I personally would be very interested in restarting that to see if there's any new evidence. But I don't see any indication that there's going to be any active group pursuing that again. The evidence that we, of course, found was not only those stone markings, but also the very careful mapping and the projecting of the intersecting lines into the middle of Cape Cod Bay. I would still like to go and flash mirrors between the fire towers of Wellfleet and Plymouth, but I don't know of any immediate plan to do that.
Could you mention Cove Cemetery in Eastham, where Constance Hopkins Snow is buried with her husband Nicholas Snow, and either pilgrim passengers and their descendants are buried?
Yes, I should have mentioned that, and I'm very glad you did, because the Cove Cemetery is an important burial place in direct relationship to Mayflower passengers. So thank you very much for mentioning that. I should have done that.
Let's see. These questions are just rolling in. Okay. What is the name of James Baker's book?
Okay, the title is Made in America, and then the subtitle is The Pilgrim's Story and How It Grew, and it's published by the Mayflower Society. And the various chapters include things about clothing, about music, about monuments and memorials, and some of the truth about Plymouth Rock, as well as some other things that tie into the commerce and other aspects of the culture of the Mayflower passengers. So it's an interesting read. and he covers a lot of territory, and it's brand new scholarship published this year.
Okay. Let's see. Is the stone still there at Anthony's?
Oh, yes, yes, it is. I have no problem finding it. If you want to meet me at Anthony's Comaquid on a morning, so that they're not open for a restaurant business, I'd be happy to walk you through the woods down to the shore, and we could probably find it again very easily.
I believe the remains of the Sparrowhawk are in the Maritime Museum in Hyannis. What can you say about that?
Yes, you're right about that. They did take some of the timbers, and the Maritime Museum in Hyannis does have that, and of course it has the story of the Sparrowhawk. But there are still some timbers that are buried in the sand in their place where they have where the ship foundered for the second time.
Where are the timbers of the Sparrowhawk sometimes visible?
It's in the shore of the Cape that is around the entrance to Pleasant Bay. And I'd have to go and look it up and check it to be absolutely certain, but the foundering happened somewhere near the entrance to Pleasant Bay, but on the outer shore.
All right, so we've got one more. And that question is, what happened at First Encounter Beach?
Okay. And in a very early in the time after the arrival of the Mayflower passengers, they went exploring. And perhaps it was the second or third day, I can't recall, they came across a cache of what was Indian corn, what we would call it today. And it was clearly something that had been stored for the winter. Were also graves there of native peoples. And the Pilgrims were, of course, in a situation where they needed food. And so they helped themselves to the corn. Obviously, although they didn't actually see any native peoples, they were being watched. And so on a day or so later, they were further exploring down the coast, the inner part of Cape Cod Bay, and they were attacked by a group of native peoples, and arrows were shot, and the Plymouth residents returned fire. No one was killed. I don't think anyone was actually even injured, but obviously that was a retaliatory strike for the what we would call today a robbery of the cache of corn and other implements that were near some graves. It was at a later time that the colonials repaid the Wampanoag for having taken those things. It was some years later, but things were settled at a later time. And so that first encounter was the time when arrows were shot and guns were fired back.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dave, so much. Really appreciate all your knowledge and you being willing to share it with us. And so I just put Dr. Martin's email in the chat. So again, please feel free to send your questions his way. He's been kind enough to offer to answer them even after the event is over. And we will be circulating, as Mike said, the link to this recording within 2 weeks. So also be on the lookout for that. And with further ado, I am going to toss it back to Mike.
Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Dr. Martin, for that captivating presentation. And to our attendees, we appreciate your participation, and we hope you will complete a brief 2-minute survey, which you will receive within the next few hours. This event has already helped us raise $210 for the Cape Cod Tufts Club's Scholarship Fund. If you are so inclined, we hope you will consider making a gift to this fund. Amanda will post that link now so you can do so online. Finally, I would like to invite everyone to join us again on June 4th for our annual meeting, which will feature a very timely virtual presentation on China-US relations. So watch for a registration email that will be sent to all of you soon. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and please stay safe and be well.
Thank you.